Hi, everybody. Welcome back to part 2 of the neuroscience of estrangement, the neuroscience of emotional immaturity, and the missing piece here amongst the entire conversation about estrangement. And I'm going to keep doing a series on this, and because it's so vitally important and there's so much research that we can go through. I'm excited for that. And let me know too in the comments if you know what questions you have, if anything's unclear, if anything is, if you have ideas for other videos you want me to make. That's always very helpful for me. I want to just clarify something that I said, which was that I was talking about the idea of when I was taught in school not to say things that have already been said. I was meaning, and it might not have been totally clear, but what I was meaning was I'm tired of hearing abusive people say the same abusive things on the internet. I am not at all saying that people who have suffered trauma and abuse should be quiet. That is not what I meant. We've heard the same abusive voices forever, right? I don't know who said this, and if you know who said this or where this originates from, but I heard it from somebody else, but it's like the axe doesn't remember the tree, but the tree always remembers the axe. This is what I mean. Childhood abuse survivors who are coming in and telling their stories. I support you. We want to hear from you. You are the tree. You've been hearing the critical, abusive, manipulative, victim-based things over and over again from your emotionally mature, narcissistic parent. Please continue to share your stories. They are so important, I think, in this conversation because, one, you've been silenced your whole life. You're probably continuing to be silenced by your family. And this is a broader conversation societally as well of how often we hear from people who have more power. And I talk about this in my course, Will I Ever Be Good Enough, in much greater detail, which is when a parent who already holds a ton of power in the household is also emotionally immature or has narcissistic features or has unhealed trauma, unhealed wounding, the entire family is going to revolve around that person. And so when estranged parents are confused and they believe the myth that the parent-child relationship is a two-way street, they tend to, again, conflate needing to be like a perfect parent with what we're actually saying, which is just a good enough parent. And the neurobiological research around attachment never said that a person had to be a perfect parent. So we can just end that conversation now. That is not what adult children are saying. I have not heard that. And again, when I've worked through my work with families for years, I never once heard a child be like, I want you to be perfect, mom and dad. No, they would say, I need you to be aware of your wounding and how it's affecting me. And we've been talking a lot about this in my daily live show called Somatic Sadhana. I teach it Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. Pacific time. We've been talking about this parent-child psychological power differential in somatic sadhana. So if you're interested in that, I recommend taking my course, Will I Ever Be Good Enough? Take that first. It's $49. I've tried to make it as affordable as possible so people can access it. And then you have the option to join the membership if you want help implementing all the things that I teach, because it really requires a daily practice to start to rewire everything that I'm going to be talking about. And you're going to see why, because all the research that I'm going to present to you it's complex. There's a lot to do to heal from childhood trauma. It's not just cognitive, talking about it, thinking about it, having awareness. That's the very first step. And then the rest is starting to implement and starting to shift everything, even from the molecular level. And that's one of my specialties in neuroscience, is at the molecular level, which I really love and find really fun. Just following up from part 1 of my commentary on the Oprah episode, I'm going to talk about this idea of, are we being too hard on parents? I know that some parents come into the comments and feel like we're all being too hard on them. I'm going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what accountability looks like. And then I'm going to go into more research. One on the adverse childhood experiences study, which has been going on for 20, 30 years and continuing to develop. This is a large scale, thousands and thousands of tens of thousands of people who have been studied at the sociological level. We're going to look at the effects of childhood maltreatment, including emotional mental abuse, on outcomes in adulthood, both at the physical health level and more psychological level. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the stress response system in your body and how this is a massive missing piece in the conversation about childhood mental emotional abuse, let alone physical sexual abuse, because that stress response system has been overlooked for 20, 30 years now and is starting to come back around now that we have newer, more accurate research on it. So we're going to talk about that, what that looks like. Again, I do a deep dive on that in Will I Ever Be Good Enough? It's my course below. And then how your stress response system is connected to a number of psychiatric disorders and physical health disorders. I'm not going to get fully into that just because it's quite complicated, and I explain it really thoroughly in my course. So if you're interested in that, just check that out. And then we're going to look at some various other studies, including one out of psychological medicine about maltreatment in childhood, increasing the risk of adult depression and anxiety and other issues. So we're just going to continue on with this conversation about the research and some of my initial thoughts, just again in follow-up to my first video from Oprah. And I think I'm going to be doing a series of the neuroscience of estrangement and emotional immaturity, because both here and on Instagram and elsewhere. So just be on the lookout for that. And if you aren't already subscribed, you can subscribe for free to my Substack. You can absolutely sign up for free. I'm going to name a number of articles that you can access there as well for free. I also have the paid version, which is, again, for the price of 2 coffees a month. You can access deeper dives into neuroscience and neuropsychology of trauma and just making your life better after trauma. And that's really my goal in all of this, is to frame this whole massive conversation around estrangement in a way that gives people some hope. Because I've helped a lot of people come out of this and have better relationships with themselves and others. And I think it's really important that we have some hope in all of this, but we do have to do the right work. And sometimes that work can be pretty grueling to heal from these things. And for me, my personal experience of that is it's the most rewarding work I've ever done personally. I love doing the work with people. It's just it's so amazing to watch people heal from not getting the parenting that they needed. And that includes parents themselves. And maybe that's my first point here, is if you're a parent watching my videos, or anybody who's talking about estrangement or the psychology of any of it, there's a handful of us that are having a conversation about this. One of the most productive things that you can do is to consider yourself, put yourself in the role of the child in the things that I'm talking about, rather than I was a terrible parent and then having a big shame response, which is not helping you in your relationship with your child. Consider yourself, put yourself in the position, in the shoes of the child, thinking about your childhood, your parents. This is vitally important, because if you can do that and you can start to look at, how did this actually happen to me? How did I learn these things? Where did I learn these things? That's going to be a very productive, or more productive, process in your mind that's going to help you remove or step out of some of the shame. None of what I'm saying is meant to shame anybody. And I don't think shaming anybody has ever worked, ever, since the dawn of time. I don't think that shaming people into submission, compliance, so on and so forth, has ever really worked. Not really. Treating people with love and respect and boundaries when appropriate does seem to work, though. The other thing that I'm noticing, and that I want to state really clearly, is what I hear a lot of other clinicians, psychologists, scientists saying about this, is researchers saying about this, is that we're talking about primarily the neuropsychology of mental and emotional abuse. And again, this is the thing that I think parents aren't understanding, and especially if they're estranged, and what a lot of trauma survivors actually don't understand either, because a lot of the conversation, and I saw a really heartbreaking comment, a number of heartbreaking comments, which like one of which was like, one woman said, I was so glad the day my dad punched me in the face, because I knew people might believe me more, which is just gut wrenching. And she's right. And the conversation that I want us to be having right now is, how, as a society, do we work collectively to become emotional adults? Because just because you are a biological adult, like you're 37 years old or 57 years old or 21 years old, like just because you're a biological adult based on what we consider adulthood to be, never gives us any information about whether or not you're an emotional adult. And I think that this is the conversation that we need to be having. And again, if you are an estranged parent, it's like your children, 9 times out of 10, based on my, again, clinical experience working with both sides of the aisle, are asking you to grow into an emotional adult. And that doesn't mean, oh, I can pay the bills, I can bathe myself, I can cook for myself. Those are separate logistical things that are, yes, they're adulting, but it's a completely separate conversation from being an emotional adult. And if we have childhood trauma, that's also part of our work, is we have to learn to become emotional adults. And some of us learned at too young of an age to become emotional adults. But even if that's the case, then there's still more emotional adulting work to do, because you don't really get out of childhood trauma scot-free, even if you were parentified, because that's its own wound, right? So we all need to be talking about, and I think this entire conversation needs to come back to, what are the effects of mental emotional abuse on the child? And how do we all become emotional adults so that we can stop this intergenerational trauma of mental and emotional abuse? Okay. So all that being said, next piece is, are we being too hard on parents? This is an interesting one, because we didn't have this information 20, 30 years ago. But that's not what I'm hearing adult children ask for. Again, I cannot stress this enough. If you're like, my child wants me to be perfect and wants me to do everything right and be a soulmate parent, like Dr. Coleman says, it's like, that is not what children are asking for. And when you do that, you're catastrophizing. It's just a cognitive error, okay? And it's saying, I must have to do all of this. It's like, it's perfectionism in your own mind. Nobody's asking you to be perfect. And I really want you to understand that. And actually, a parent who can own their own humanity at a really deep level and own their imperfection is so much more relatable to a child. Like I have chosen family that I really love, and we were at the Louvre, and because they came to visit me, and they have 3 boys who I love so much, and they kept getting in trouble for taking. They had like a piece of paper, they had like their tour guide, and their tour brochure, and they kept poking at the paintings in the Louvre. They're kids. And they kept getting reprimanded by the museum people. And I was starting to get activated. Now, there's a lot going on. There was like tons of people. Obviously, it's the Louvre. It's packed. I didn't want them to keep getting in trouble. I was starting to feel dysregulated. And this is not to say ever that I'm perfect either, but at one point they got so close to one of the paintings. These are like 12th century, like Renaissance paintings. And they're like, they're just excited, right? They're excited. They're like forgetting what they've been told. And I snapped at one of them and I said, stop it. You cannot do that. These are priceless paintings. And again, I'm used to nanny them. They're used to me being a bit of a mother figure to them. This is not necessarily like their mother allows me to hold boundaries with them. This is not an uncommon thing. But I really want to be a safe place for them. And I didn't like that I did that. And I saw one of them, both of them go, and it was coming from my own, oh my God, like reactivity, which is some of my own stuff. And I needed to own that as a sort of parent figure to them. And then one of them, the older one, scurries away. Like he literally goes into an actual flight response away from me. And I realized I had done something that felt unsafe to them. Now, again, I can have a boundary and also not be so like snappy. And I'm usually not with them. I'm usually quite measured and things like that when I'm with them. And I went and I said right away, I said, hey, I'm really sorry. That was too much from me. And I'm sorry. I shouldn't have snapped at you. I didn't. That's all I said. And you could see their little bodies. Oh, thanks. And I think that this is what I'm, again, trying to name, which is nobody's asking you to be perfect. Please let go of that. Your children are asking you to just step into your own humanity and to heal from the chronic toxic shame that's actually driving most people's behavior. Okay? Because if I had gone into a big shame spiral, I wouldn't have been available for, oh God, I fucked up and I'm sorry. And we were able to repair and have connection again. That's the most important part, is the repair. Repair is most of the time more important than the rupture. There's another moment where we were on another tour, and if you know me, I have really a severe celiac disease, so I can't eat any gluten ever, but I wanted to get everybody croissants before we went on to this tour. And so I take the oldest one. And so we go in and I'm like, okay, I'll just buy everybody croissants because they're all freezing and I'm trying to help them with all those things. And the oldest one was like, Jenna, I don't think we should ask everybody if they want croissants. I was like, no, we'll just surprise them. And of course, it's Paris and the croissants are expensive. And I buy them anyway. I don't listen to him. And we come out and nobody wants them. No, nobody wanted a croissant in that moment. And he was right. He's 13. Like, he knows his family. And I was just trying to like be nice, right? And I want everybody to be warm and I want them to have calories in their body. It's like the old wilderness therapist in me where I'm like, you need fat in your body. You need some carbohydrates. It's going to keep you warm, because they were all freezing. Right? So positive intention on my end. And I didn't listen to him. And then we had to take turns like carrying the bag of croissants around all day. Because nobody wanted the croissants and they didn't have the heart to throw them away. And so I was just like laughing so hard because I had to then say to him, I was like, you know what? I'm really sorry. I didn't take you serious. I said, I owe you an apology to the oldest child. I didn't listen to you about the croissants. And you were right. And now we've all been stuck carrying these stupid croissants around all day. It's like these little things where it's like I didn't take him seriously. I had my own agenda. And these might seem like small things, but relationships are built in the small moments like that. And I'm not like, oh, you must think I'm the worst. I didn't do that. This is what children are asking for, is just to take some responsibility that you didn't take them seriously. You were unsafe. And I think it's so important that we all look at what are the ways in which I might be psychologically, emotionally unsafe for the people in my life. How can I be more approachable? How can I be more open to feedback? Now, again, with a parent-child relationship, I'm not saying to the adult survivors of a narcissistic parent relationship that you now need to be open to your parents' feedback. That's a different thing. But I think if you were raised by a narcissistic, emotionally immature parent, you might not be good at receiving feedback, as one example, in other areas of your life. This is just the wounding that we then need to take care of and clean up, that we all will have if we have some childhood trauma, if we were not raised to be emotional adults, okay? So never am I saying, oh, like you know, as an adult child, you now need to repair with your parents. Sometimes it's not possible because the parent's not accountable at all. So please just hear me that I'm just talking more globally as people in general, whether you're parent or child, that have childhood trauma where we then are not emotionally safe. And so if I want as an adult to be more of an emotionally safe person, I have to look at my childhood trauma and how that's impacted me. So I hope you see, I'm just talking about the kind of cyclical nature of these kind of intergenerational psychological patterns that get passed on. that are maladaptive. They're maladaptive psychological. In computational neuroscience, we call it hyperpriors. I'm going to talk about that in another video this week or next. So just be on the lookout for that. And it's the ways in which our brain kind of jumps to conclusions because we have unhealed trauma. So when I'm speaking to parents, it's like those little moments where you might have missed your kid. That's what I'm talking about, as you taking responsibility. I was dysregulated. I didn't have the capacity. I didn't get enough sleep last night. I chose to marry a narcissistic person that abused you. I have a substance abuse problem. I'm not saying this is me. I'm just giving you examples of what parents can take ownership for. These are not things that I've done, but it's like, say those things. But this requires you looking at yourself as a parent. This is what adult children are asking for. And you would be amazed at how quickly an adult child is ready to come back into contact with a parent who is willing to do that, to take responsibility for themselves. So when people are saying you're being too hard on parents, to any of us, because all of us that talk about this topic, all get that. We all get the same kind of comments, again, from people who don't look at themselves. Please hear me on that. It's not people who are abused. We want to hear from you. If you were abused, I want to hear what happened. I want to hear. You don't have to share what happened if you don't want to, but we want to hear from you if you've been abused, because you've been silenced your whole life. That is the problem. I saw some accountability from some parents in the comments. That was really, I just commend those parents. There was one woman that acknowledged that she could understand why her child was estranged from her. She's not trying to win them back. She acknowledges the immense amount of trauma that she endured and was having symptoms from that made it very difficult for her to parent. This is the kind of parent that's in the small minority of this group of estranged parent when it comes to estrangement, because she's holding both things. I was traumatized, and that then caused me to traumatize my children. That's the thing here. That's what we see in the neurobiological research, again, about good enough parenting. That is all that we're asking for, is good enough. And for people to develop, it's a nervous system capacity issue where people can stay in their bodies and feel big feelings at the same time without dissociating or checking out through whatever behavior they tend to do that with. She's holding both. This is, again, the dialectical that parents need to build the capacity to be able to hold. And again, it doesn't happen through more cognitive work or more understanding. It happens through nervous system work and building more of a sense of self and an ego strength, an internal stability that is not so shame-based that then crumbles at the first moment of feedback, where you probably had that happen to you. And then somebody's coming in, your child who really matters to you, for a lot of you, and your child's coming in and giving you an evaluation, basically. And I can really feel for you around that. And it's your responsibility to build yourself back up from that kind of environment where you were shamed, blamed, scapegoated, all the things. This didn't come out of nowhere. You didn't learn this from nowhere. Children don't come out of the womb like narcissistic or emotionally immature. I guess emotionally immature, yes, they are. But they don't come out of the womb with a personality disorder. But they can come out with a very activated stress response system and a nervous system state that's very stressed because they take all that in. So do you hear what I'm saying here? This is the pattern that we have to all work on. And like, I know what it means to be like, here, you weren't perfect. And it's okay. No one's asking you to be perfect, and it's okay if you weren't. What needs to happen, though, is that your children tend to feel like your ego is like a house of cards. Your sense of self is like a house of cards. And if there's even so much as the slightest gust of wind, that whole house of cards comes crumbling down, and they have to pick up the pieces for you. That's what children don't want to have to do. It's not their job to make you feel better. Okay? And I'm going to name facts from science that are about emotional abuse. And that's not me not having compassion for parents. That's just, I'm going to present the facts about this. And then you need to take ownership for that. And that you might have propagated some of this in your own life. And that being said, I'm also not going to coddle parents in here either. But I'm doing two things at the same time. I'm not going to coddle people, but I'm also going to have compassion from where you came from. Those are two separate things, and we can do both of those at the same time. I can have compassion for your trauma history, but you need to take responsibility for your role in continuing intergenerational trauma through emotional immaturity. And then we can also not coddle people in here. Or people with narcissistic wounding. If you were raised by a narcissistic person, it's also going to be very difficult to take in feedback. It's really normal. It's very human for any of us to. So we can have narcissistic wounding and have a really hard time taking feedback in because we were raised by a very narcissistic person, and then you were constantly criticized, belittled, shamed, blamed, scapegoated. So of course people are going to have a reaction to that. It's very human. It's very human to want our positive intentions to be seen too. So let's just remember that this is all part of our shared humanity. And when we talk about, are we being too tough on parents? It's like, would you not hold a stranger accountable for the same behavior? If somebody came up to me and started screaming at me on the street and belittling me and mocking me and putting me down, would we tolerate that from a stranger? No. Being someone's parent, and this is, I think, just a big shift, does not give you the right to access them their entire lives unless you earn that right through respect and emotional maturity and treating them with respect. Somebody in the comments reminded me of a poem that I share a lot with parents to help them understand this. It's a Khalil Gibran poem called On Children. I think it's Khalil Gibran. On Children. It's a great poem for any parent to read. Yeah, Khalil Gibran. Highly recommend. And actually, it's short, so I'm going to read this. And a woman who held a babe against her bosom said, "Speak to us of children." And he said, "Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you. For life goes not backward, nor tarries with yesterday. You are the bows from which your children, as living arrows, are sent forth. The archer sees the mark upon the path of the infinite, and he bends you with his might that his arrows may go swift and far. Let your bending in the archer's hand be for gladness, for even as he loves the arrow that flies, so he loves the bow that is stable. This is from the prophet. Do you hear that? Children are like arrows. And if you are a stable archer, you might send forth your living arrows to make their mark upon the path of the infinite, is what he's saying. So all you can do is hold that you were the bow from which the arrow of your child was shot forth. Right? And if you weren't steady, if you weren't stable, it never serves you to be in shame about that. What will serve you is to look at why you were not a stable, skilled archer, and to find compassion for yourself as an imperfect human. That's the place that your child is wanting to relate to you from. And for you to mourn and grieve and not avoid that, not avoid the grief and mourning that needs to happen around what didn't go well because you didn't have the skills or the tools. And in conjunction with that, making a very concerted effort to do everything you can to become a more stable archer in that way. You guys hear this? It's complicated, right? It's nuanced. But that's what I hear from adult children. And adult children, like, comment in the comment below, right? What is it? What do you deeply long for from your parent? I might miss stuff and I can't cover everything, right? But this is what I hear from adult children all the time is please just own how you impacted me. How you impacted me, okay? So we all need to grow in our emotional maturity to become emotional adults. And if we had childhood trauma, that will always be a primary goal in the work. Again, because we learn maladaptive emotional patterns from our parents too, if we were raised by an emotionally immature person, right? It's just, again, we're not acknowledging the trauma that children went through at the same time. But everybody in the world has to work on this. Everybody in the world this is just part of life, to become an adult in this way. It's just that we're finally talking about what this means, what it means to become an emotional adult, and it's not okay anymore to continue to not work on it. That's what the conversation is about. It's not okay anymore to not work on this, right? This has been happening for thousands of years throughout history, especially in more individualistic cultures or more immature cultures who don't have as much wisdom within that culture. One of my degrees is in anthropology, so I like to bring in culture as well. In more collectivistic cultures, they tend to have more wisdom. There tends to be better systems of community-based accountability, like the community coming together and saying to somebody, hey, why are you behaving in this way? And how can we come together to support you to get better? I don't believe, again, shaming anyone ever helps because, again, many of these parents have so much exiled shame, and that's actually what's keeping them from taking responsibility for themselves and their lives, including the reason their children are estranged from them. Okay, so now let's get into some science. I'm going to share my article that I wrote because I summarize it. It's available to everybody. Okay, so if you're not on Substack, I highly recommend it. Jenna Pacelli, I think just Google my name and the Holistic Neuroscientist, and and we'll put the link below. But let me just share my screen. Okay. So, what they don't tell you about mental health disorders. We talked about this in the first video. The childhood trauma is correlated with an increase in all-cause mortality. This article is about the adverse childhood experiences study. I'm going to go into some of the limitations of this research as well. This is what we call big data research. It's research that's been done on tens of thousands of people. So we see an effect of childhood trauma, including mental and emotional abuse and neglect, as being very psychologically relevant or just generally relevant in terms of informing adult outcomes. And what that means is it really impacts people later on in life. And we're going to talk more about why that is in a little bit when we get into the HPA axis, your stress response system, which I'm just going to touch into. Now, the first of this study came out in the 1980s. They tested over 9,500 patients in San Diego for a history of the following adverse childhood experiences: physical abuse from a parent, emotional abuse from a parent, sexual abuse from anyone, growing up with an alcohol or drug abuser in the home, experiencing the incarceration of a household member, living with a family member experiencing mental illness, domestic violence in the home, the loss of a parent, emotional neglect, physical neglect. Okay. So these are our kind of subdomains of childhood trauma. And they started studying this because a number of people were dropping out of weight loss groups. And the people that dropped out had the highest ACEs scores. And they said that the way that they felt when they lost weight was unbearable. So they're like, what? What's happening here? And so we can jump into whatever translation we want of that. It probably is very person specific, but they then studied a follow-up sample of over 17,000 people, and additional findings show that adverse childhood experiences, the higher the score, the more likely you are to have an increased risk of suicide attempts across the lifespan, an increased risk for broken bones, increased risk for heart disease, lung disease, liver disease, and multiple types of cancer. And the higher your ACEs score is, it is also associated with impaired job functioning, under earning financially, houselessness, and criminal justice involvement. They have replicated the study many times across cultures with the same results. Sorry, you can't see all of that. Hang on a second. Let me just make me a little smaller here. There we go. And so that's important too. This is not just this culture or that culture. It seems to be pretty ubiquitous. Like childhood trauma will lead or be very strongly correlated with these outcomes. So we really have to look at when people are struggling as adults, why that is. And we need to help them. We need to support them towards trauma resolution. Okay. And 1 in 6 adults have experienced 4 or more types of ACEs. Half of the leading causes of death are associated with ACEs. Preventing ACEs can reduce rates of depression by 44%. I'm going to show you another study that shows similar numbers there. Toxic stress, which we're going to get into in a moment, from ACEs changes brain development. Trauma increases amygdala size, which is your threat response center, and reduces hippocampal size, which is your memory center. Again, these are all very simplified. ACEs are very common, and their effects add up over time. Okay. Now, the problem, though, is that the researchers interviewed medical providers at Kaiser where the research was conducted, and most of them hadn't even heard of the study. And I would say that still this is the case. A lot of medical providers, I'm not speaking for everybody, of course. I know that there are a lot of them out there that are becoming trauma informed, but we really need more doctors to become trauma informed because, again, my theory on this is that childhood trauma is one of the most overlooked confounding variables in physical health research as to where these issues are coming from. And so that has to be taken into consideration, in my opinion. And it wouldn't be hard. In some ways, it's not hard. You can always just give people a questionnaire. Now, there's various limitations with questionnaires and retrospective studies and research and things like that, because people's memories can change and their memory is always being updated every time you recall a memory. But let me know if you're interested in that too, like memory, what we call memory reconsolidation and trauma. That's another interest of mine. And if you're interested in that, I can do more videos on that. So this is problematic. And I've worked with a number of, especially women, who are coming in with various physical health issues that doctors think are purely psychological, and then they'll send them to psych because they don't realize how much stress and trauma are impacting the stress system, which is then impacting the inflammatory system, which is then impacting everything else in the body. And so this is one of the biggest myths that I am really working hard to bust or to educate people on, which is that the biggest myth that we've been told is that the mind and the body are separate. They are constantly informing one another. Connection and emotional intelligence are some of the most important protective factors. We need to also look at that, right? If somebody who's growing up with mental emotional abuse is not going to fare well, typically, if they didn't have enough of a resource in an adult as a child. And so oftentimes, and this is often the case, is folks who had even one person who was a safer person for them psychologically, that can be such a positive protective factor for them, especially in our work, because they can really we can really utilize that as they had some felt sense of safety growing up from even one person, and that can really make a difference. So having an attuned, empathic, emotionally intelligent caregiver, based on the research, is the single most important protective factor of preventing mental illness, childhood trauma, and struggles later in life. Again, here I go. The parent doesn't have to be perfect. They just have to be good enough and making sense of their own past so it doesn't unconsciously affect their child. Okay, so you can read more of this. I put a video in there. We have to look at shame as well. We have to look at what we call coupling dynamics as the core of most mental health disorders and diagnoses, and what doesn't seem to work, especially in complex trauma. Folletti et al. Is the original 1998 paper on ACEs, and they found a clear graded association between the number of reported childhood abuse categories and household dysfunctions and multiple adult health risk factors. And diseases, I'm getting into some of the limitations here because there's always limitations in research. Like we have to remember that. There's always no study's ever going to be perfect. We have to look at the limitations, and science has to just keep improving, and statistics within that research has to keep improving in terms of the statistical methods that people use to get these results. It's very complicated. Researchers work really hard typically to control for confounding variables, which means maybe overlooked variables that could be impacting the results that are being overlooked, and then you think it's something else causing the outcome. So big data like this can be really good for statistical power, and that means that we can more reliably count on what the data is saying. If you have a study with 3 people versus a study with 10,000 people, the study with 10,000 people is going to give us probably more statistically significant outcomes that we can more readily rely on. Big data research like this gives us important insights into how things affect people as a whole at a societal level. And there's always still ongoing work to make sure the ACEs survey can be even more specific and precise. But there's no argument really amongst researchers, scientists, clinicians who are at least trauma-informed and up to date on the research that early adversity in life is bad for you. So we also really need to continue to include and consider poverty and societal inequality, racism, gender-based violence are as traumas themselves and highly stressful. If you've ever been struggling financially, you know what I'm talking about, let alone if you've been struggling financially your whole life, right? It's so stressful. We have to just be careful around ACEs scores as well, that they might not always predict individual level outcomes. Sometimes people don't fit this mold, and that's okay. It's just this is big data research that tells us at a societal level what is causing these problems. Trauma. When I'm making a causal thing there, but a causal statement there, but there's a massive, very strong, clear correlation between adverse childhood experiences, early life stress, and later poor adult outcomes, both at the physical and mental health levels. Okay. I think it's also important to name this ACEs research can leave people feeling pathologized or demoralized, especially people in marginalized groups, because it's presented sometimes as if you have a high score, you're therefore broken, or you can't fix this, you can't come out of this. And commentaries like this emphasize that the ACEs score also ignores protective factors and positive childhood experiences, which again are super important to be taken into consideration. And then they also often can fail at the individual level, especially to adequately situate adversity within poverty, racism, and other social determinants, rather than framing it, again, solely as individual or family pathology, right? This is so important that we think about this, right? This is what I mean by the individualistic versus collectivistic culture. Why do we have rampant narcissism and emotional immaturity going on? We can't just blame the family system either. We have to look at how are people so stressed that they then develop all these kind of psychopathologies. It's not just individual. We can't just blame individuals either. Okay. It's the whole thing together. I think we have to look and continue always to move towards a more nuanced, theoretically grounded measure of adversity and trauma, and to just avoid using the adverse childhood experiences scores as deterministic labels or standalone decision tools, right? There's lots of psychometric testing that we can do that sort of supports more of a well-rounded diagnostic approach. But I just take that as you will, right? We have to look at this at multiple levels. It's a broader conversation. It's individual. At the individual level, it's the family systems level, and it's societal level. Okay. All right. Now let's get into just a super brief overview of your stress response system. I dive into this in much more detail in my course, and I try to break it down in a way that is very layperson friendly so that it's accessible for people, because it's vital that you understand the way that trauma gets stuck in the body at this literal cellular level. Okay. And we have both animal models of this, which means we're testing mice and how that gets passed on. Okay. So let's move this over. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit so you can see it. You don't need this is from a Nature article. Nature is a very high caliber journal. And this is a schematic representation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis. Okay, now stay with me here, guys. So this is one of my specialties. And the reason that we haven't talked much about this, or you haven't heard much about this, is because they did studies back in the 80s and 90s, but those studies weren't quite good enough. And so it made it look like there wasn't an effect from the stress response system on the things that we're going to be talking about, but there was. So now it's coming back around, especially at King's College, where my degree in neuroscience is from. They do a lot of this research here, especially at the molecular level, because this is in many ways, a molecular issue. So this is basically the way that your stress response system is going to go a little haywire when there's chronic unresolved stress. We have a stressor. Here's your brain. Okay. And that stressor sends signals to the hippocampus and the amygdala. The amygdala is really important here. This is your salience center, basically. It's, do I like this thing or do I not like this thing? Will this kill me or hurt me, or will it help me propagate my genetic makeup into the future? So we have a stressor, those signals are being sent there. And then the amygdala is sending signals to the hypothalamus, all right? And then the hypothalamus sends that signal to the anterior pituitary gland. And the anterior pituitary gland then sends ACTH to the adrenal cortex, which is down lower in your body. Now, the adrenal cortex is then creating cortisol, okay? And then this cortisol, you see these red lines here, the cortisol is an anti-inflammatory, okay? This matters. This is important. So we have cortisol. So when cortisol goes into the system, it helps to reduce inflammation. The cortisol is meant to act back on this system itself. So this is what these red lines are. So cortisol is supposed to go back and say, hey guys, we're good. The stressor's over. Stop producing cortisol. Stop producing corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH. Stop producing ACTH, right? And this is the way when a stressor, which a stressor is supposed to be short-lived, that stressor stops. So now that you've seen that image, you see it goes from the stress response is sending signals to your brain then sends responses to your adrenal glands, and then the adrenal glands are producing the cortisol. I'm just giving you a pretty basic overview. Then that cortisol is meant to act back on itself. So under normal conditions, cortisol acts as the body's built-in fire extinguisher, essentially, for inflammation. So it enters cells, it binds to a receptor, like a docking station, and then together they move into the nucleus of the cell to turn the volume down on inflammatory genes and turn on calming repair supporting genes. Okay. Again, super simplified, but just so you understand. So the cortisol is meant to go into and work with its receptor sites to then move into the center of the cell, of all your cells, and turn off those, again, or just turn the volume down at the very least, those inflammatory genes. Okay. Because your genes, your DNA is telling your body how to produce proteins, essentially. So what happens now is cortisol docks into a glucocorticoid receptor site. It's a steroid receptor. So again, a steroid reduces inflammation. So what happens when there's chronic stress is the body's going to go into what we call glucocorticoid resistance, where that whole calming pathway stops working so well. So the cortisol might be high, but the signal it's sending becomes weaker because the glucocorticoid receptors either are reduced in number or change in function. So it's like now it's got nowhere to go. So the cortisol is just being pumped through the body. So the receptor, again, may be present in lower amounts or less effective forms that the cortisol can't dock. And the receptor and its helper proteins may not fold or travel properly into the nucleus as well of the cell. And then the nucleus may not respond well when the receptor tries to switch the genes off. So there's lots of different things that's happening again at the molecular level. And so chronic stress and long-term inflammation constantly activate alarm systems inside our cells. And these alarm pathways will interfere with cortisol's calming pathways, like background noise drowning out a quiet voice. The result is that inflammatory genes will stay switched on more easily, even though cortisol is trying to turn them down. This is a possible mechanism for autoimmune disorder, right? Because then that's going to also start to trigger the immune system, right? Because you have an inflammatory response, and also what you're going to get is inflammatory cytokines in the immune system that are coming in. So what's then happening in the immune system as well is the immune cells are also detecting threat, and they release in what we call inflammatory cytokines like interleukin 1 beta, we call it IL-1 beta, interleukin 6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNF alpha, to coordinate a defense response. Normally, rising cortisol feeds back onto these same cells and their receptors to dial that response back down. So you see how cortisol is managing all of this, or affecting this whole system. And so that's going to limit how much and how long cytokines are then produced. So you have an inflammatory response, or you have a stress response, then you have an inflammatory response, and you have an immune response. And so with glucocorticoid resistance, or GR resistance, that brake on the system starts to weaken. It's like the brakes in the car stop working as well. Okay. And we see this in somatic work all the time. Clinicians don't really realize this is what's going on, is the brake stops working. This is what's happening in many cases in addiction, as people lose the ability to access calming brain states like alpha brain waves and things like that. It's all connected, guys, right? So that with the GR resistance, the brake in the car, in the nervous system weakens, and at the cellular level, it weakens because your whole body has afferent signals. So afferent means from the body up to the brain, and we receive signaling from the body to the brain by cells that attach onto the nervous system throughout the body. So the receptor signals inside those immune cells are also blunted. So even normal or high cortisol can't fully shut off cytokine production. Okay. So now we've got an out of control immune response and an out of control inflammatory response. So as a result, the immune cells stay more in an on state, and all those inflammatory cytokines and related cytokines remain elevated compared to what you'd expect for that cortisol level. I recently saw somebody who, they're like a wellness influencer, and she was saying, I got some treatment where they removed all the inflammatory cytokines from my body. It's not It's not possible. That'd be like saying that you removed all the blood from your body. It just doesn't make any sense. We need these cytokines too. On the flip side, we don't want no inflammation. We don't want no immune response. We just want the right amounts. And so it's not really ever the case that somebody's going to have all of their inflammatory molecules removed from their body, or all their inflammatory cytokines removed from their body. It just doesn't make sense. So let's just, as a side note, let's just be aware of, we do want some inflammation. Inflammation is not all bad, right? Inflammation is useful to the body in a lot of ways. It serves a function, as do these immune responses. So just as a side note. So these inflammatory cytokines don't just escape cortisol's control. They can actively worsen glucocorticoid resistance. And so signals downstream of cytokines interfere with how the glucocorticoid receptor moves into the nucleus and binds to the DNA. So it makes the cell even less sensitive to cortisol over time. Now, this is going to create a self-reinforcing loop. More inflammatory cytokines means more receptor resistance, which means a weaker cortisol brake, which means even more cytokines. This is also going to lead to a whole other conversation, but I talk about this in my course as well, which is that's going to also be very closely related to your gut health and gut permeability, your liver health, and local inflammatory responses that the liver creates, and then the inflammatory responses that come from your brain and through your blood-brain barrier, because we are finding that the blood-brain barrier can also become leaky, and then that starts to create neuroinflammation, okay? And neuroinflammation means that has been connected as well to a number of physical and mental health disorders. Inflammation in general in the body has been connected to physical and mental health disorders. Do we see what's going on here, guys? This it's vital. This is vital to understand. So again, this is the neuroscience module in my course goes into deeper elements of this so you can really understand it. And again, I try to make it as clear as possible so you're not just feeling like you're in a super boring neuroscience class. So that's the HPA axis. And one of the things I'm very excited and passionate about, because we have to look at this. It's also why I call my membership the Cellular Healing Collective, because we have to look at this and work at the molecular level too. And that can happen through diet, through stress reduction techniques. It can happen through supplementation. It's not just one size fits all. There's no drug that's going to fix all of this for you. It's really important that we stay away from that. I think people want to have some quick fix. It's not a quick fix. I've had people with really severe childhood trauma, both at the physical, sexual, and emotional levels, work with me for a handful of years and also work with a functional medicine doctor. And we were running blood work the whole time. And she had which is also very common in PTSD, which is a very flat cortisol curve, basically saying that her cortisol system's not really working, which is very common in PTSD. And over time, her cortisol curve has started to normalize because of our work together, but it's through supplementation, diet, and the somatic interoceptive work that I teach. So it's all these things together, which is what I teach in the course. Will I ever be good enough? And in my membership, and to help you implement all these things, it's coming from urine testing. But we can see the cortisol levels starting to normalize. We want high cortisol in the mornings, and then over the course of the day, we want that cortisol to dip and then be replaced with melatonin so that you can fall asleep. There's a lot of research that's now connecting HPA axis dysfunction with a number of psychiatric disorders, especially depression. I'm going to wrap it up with a couple more studies here. Yeah, for today. I've seen documented changes to the cortisol curve that needs to happen. This person couldn't leave the house. She couldn't hold a job. She was in toxic relationships. And I think it's important, and lots of struggles there, and in and out of inpatient treatment for various things. And she's now engaged. She has better relationships. She's held a job for 2 years. She's starting her own business. I'm really proud of her. And we often joke that she wants to come to London to do research with me so I could study her brain. She's doing great. I just don't always have the opportunity to see the work in tangent with blood work. It's just not always possible. So it's a kind of a cool case study of where the work can go. From the Journal of Psychological Medicine shows that maltreatment in childhood substantially increases the risk of adult depression and anxiety in prospective cohort studies. It's a systematic review and meta-analysis. This paper shows that there's robust evidence of childhood maltreatment increasing the risk for depression and anxiety, and reinforces the need for effective programs and policies to reduce its occurrence. They say that childhood maltreatment is a leading contributor to the development of depression and anxiety disorders amongst children and adults, and it contributes to the emergence of psychopathology through many neurobiological mechanisms. Number one, the stress system, like we just talked about. 2, structural brain differences. This is neuroimaging research. The hippocampus, amygdala, corpus callosum, and other white matter tracts, which means the functional connectivity between brain regions, and the prefrontal cortex. Number 3, functional brain differences like hyperactivity of the amygdala in response to negative facial affect or angry faces. People have a stress response in the face of that. There is some role of genetics and epigenetics of resilience and vulnerability at play here. But again, I would say that's informed by trauma, especially based on what we know from mice models and intergenerational trauma research on Holocaust survivors. We see the impact epigenetically from a major trauma that's been passed on. And then maltreatment in childhood is also a threat to the optimal development of effective processing ability. So again, your ability to process your emotions, your attachment relationships, self-system processes, peer relationships, and adaptation to school. And then next paper is a meta-analysis called Norman et al., The Long-Term Health Consequences of Child Physical Abuse, Emotional Abuse, and Neglect, which is a systematic review and meta-analysis. So we just shared some of that. And then a Nature article on the HPA axis dysfunction and chronic fatigue, very connected there, also in autoimmune disorders. There's a lot of physical health issues that show up that are connected to adverse childhood experiences because of the HPA axis that people go into the medical world for that doctors can't quite figure out, like functional neurological disorder. I do research on functional neurological disorder. In a lot of the FND population is very highly correlated with childhood trauma. Not always, but a lot of the time it is. So there's just a lot of relationship, right? We can see these relationships here where you start to have an issue in the stress response system, and it's going to be, if that doesn't get taken care of, right, we can see now why adult children who are estranging themselves from their narcissistic parents are trying to help themselves in this way. This is what's going on. And again, it's complicated. There's a number of different levels. There's tons of different research angles that we can look at it through. And I've summarized that as best as I can in my course, Will I Ever Be Good Enough? It's linked below. Also, I was thinking of running a live 90-minute workshop, maybe on calling it the Neuroscience of Estrangement or the Neuroscience of Emotional Immaturity. Let me know. I'm going to put a poll on Substack where you can vote for the title that you like or what the topic that you like of the workshop. I'm curious if y'all are interested in that. We can do that as a live workshop over the holidays and maybe early in the new year. But yeah, let me know which title you like, and we'll send you more information if and when I run that. I'm definitely interested in doing a live workshop and hearing from you all and hearing what you all need around this. And again, the best place to start in terms of understanding all of this at a much deeper level is my 10-hour course, Will I Ever Be Good Enough? We'll link it below, and then you'll have the chance to, if you'd like, to join my membership, the Cellular Healing Collective. And then Monday through Thursday, remember, somatic sadhana, 10 a.m. Pacific. I go through some teaching from a spiritual or psychological text that helps people develop a deeper sense of self-connection. And then folks who are in the membership, they get access to the full call. I do an integration exercise with them afterwards, an embodiment exercise right after. So you can really integrate the work. So really good to be here with you. Thank you so much. Put any questions in the comments, anything you think I should do other videos on. I've always got lots that we can talk about. Enjoy and see you next time.